Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the next part of our Asynchronous Leadership Professional Learning Community. This module is part of the series on closing the achievement gaps in mathematics using acceleration strategy. I'm Jenna Richard from the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project, and this section of the Leadership PLC will focus on the instructional planning that needs to take place for the year or the remainder of the year, depending at what point you are in when you view this module. In our work with schools and districts across the state of Rhode Island, we repeatedly hear concerns that students have experienced substantial learning loss from school closures and delays caused by COVID-19. In previous years, schools often responded by providing remediation and having the teacher go back to the previous grade level and reteach content that students had not yet mastered. This is not feasible nor efficient in our current educational situation. With limited time, restrictions on classroom helpers, and constantly changing learning environments, acceleration will address these learning challenges by allowing educators to move forward with teaching grade level standards while also providing just-in-time supports to fill gaps in students' knowledge as they come up by topic. This module is part of a series focusing on using acceleration rather than remediation to close learning gaps in mathematics by moving forward with teaching on grade level standards and providing those just-in-time supports to fill gaps in students' math knowledge when topics arise over the year. This is the first of 3 modules focusing on helping educators plan their instruction. Our objectives for this module are to determine focus standards for your current grade level. Consider how standards from previous grades inform your current grade level standards, and create an overall plan for the academic year or remainder of that uses acceleration to close learning gaps. So why focus on using acceleration? Research has shown that giving students simpler previous grade level materials results in students falling further behind in their current grade level. This can result in a vicious cycle that ratchets down student learning year after year, leaving students demoralized and unengaged. On the other hand, providing supports at the moment they are needed in the classroom helps to make on-grade level content accessible to all of our students. Students are empowered with new skills and tools that they can use with the math they are learning now. When students immediately apply new skills, they are more likely to internalize them. The New Teacher Project identifies 5 recommendations for accelerating learning. In today's module, we are going to focus on prioritizing the most critical prerequisite skills and knowledge for your grade level and how to adapt the scope and sequence and/or pacing guide to reflect where acceleration support is needed. First, we want to map out your grade level standards. So to consider what is being taught and when is it taught. Identify the most critical skills and concepts from each unit of study. When your students leave you, what will the next teacher want to know? And then trace back to standards from the previous grade. What skills and knowledge do my students need from the previous grade to be successful this year? If you're using a textbook series, it may already contain a scope and sequence, and your school may be following the pacing guide provided with it as well. The term scope and sequence is often used interchangeably with pacing guide. Depending on your district, this may be 1 or 2 documents. A pacing guide is a roadmap to making sure you teach all of the grade level standards within the course of an academic year. It usually includes benchmarks and important testing dates, district and state. It also helps educators see how much time is allotted to teach a particular concept. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the term scope and sequence is often used interchangeably with pacing guide. If using a textbook series, it may contain one, and your school may follow the pacing guide. Some districts create their own pacing guides that include time allotted for testing, school holidays, and teacher workdays or conferences. It is most helpful to look at a scope and sequence separate from the pacing guide so that you can focus on relating concepts in their presentation order to the required grade level standards. Once you've done this, we can make adjustments to our pacing guide. On the left, we see a combined scope and sequence with pacing guide that indicates standards by topic, the approximate time needed to teach the unit, and the corresponding dates on the school calendar. On the right, we see a more generalized scope and sequence that indicates only the approximate number of days needed to teach a unit of study. However, it also shows how topics build across the grades. So this would be helpful when considering where students may need extra attention. We need to remember that these documents may very well have been created prior to the current education climate, when we expect students to attend class in person 5 days a week. As such, the alignment of topics to a calendar is likely to be off and will need adjusting. For example, maybe I see my students 2 days a week in person and 2 days a week virtually, but the other weekday is used by other content areas or for small group work. If I'm teaching only in a virtual environment, I know that my time is limited and learning will take longer. Even if I am able to see my students in person, our daily routines have changed with more time needed for health and safety precautions. So I may have less instructional time with my students. Since our time is even more limited in the time of COVID, even if we are in person, we need to prioritize our scope and sequence and pacing guide by first identifying the most critical skills and topics from each standard. As we've mentioned in previous learning modules, Achieve the Core is a great resource for looking at how the math standards build across the grades. This may look familiar to many of you. Student Achievement Partners, also known as Achieve the Core, has a document for each grade level that identifies the major supporting and additional clusters for the grade, as well as any required fluencies. So first, I want to look at the major supporting and additional clusters for grade 3. Looking at this chart, major clusters are coded in green, and I've identified 4 major clusters within operations and algebraic thinking, 1 for numbers and operations, and 2 major clusters for measurement and data. Focusing on the major clusters does not mean that I will ignore the others. Rather, it's a way to think about areas where my students might need additional support. I also want to look at the required fluencies for grade 3, which in this case include single-digit products and quotients, and being able to add and subtract within 1,000. I will want to make sure to incorporate plenty of practice for my students in these 2 fluencies and to monitor my students' progress throughout the year. With the unique circumstances we're facing in school years 2021 and 21-22, Student Achievement Partners released a document showing the priority instructional content for both math and ELA in grades K through 8. We're going to look at some highlights from this document. As you can see, the left column shows the clusters and the standards for the grade, and the right column provides considerations for instruction. You will notice on this chart that all of the 4 clusters identified in operations and algebraic thinking are included, as well as the number and fractions cluster. For cluster 3OAA, represent and solve problems involving multiplication and division, there are no special considerations other than ensuring that the time spent on practice and instruction should not be reduced, meaning if you need to make time for supports, do not take that time away from these areas. For clusters 3OAB and 3OAC, which both focus on understanding multiplication and division, the guidance is to incorporate additional practice with double-digit sums, which is a 2nd grade standard, to support the operations work in this 3rd grade standard. Note that for the cluster 3OAD, solve problems involving the 4 operations and identify and explain patterns in arithmetic. Only one of the standards, 3OAD8, is considered a priority. The fraction cluster 3NFA, Develop Understandings as Fractions as Numbers, is the beginning cluster to the Numbers and Fractions pathway that begins in grade 3 and extends through grade 5. Here we see guidance on emphasizing unit fractions as the basis for building fractions and prioritizing the number line as a representation so that students understand that fractions are numbers just like whole numbers. They plotted on the number line in second grade. From this same document, we can also see considerations for the remaining grade level content. Here we see that the other standard from 30AD can be eliminated for this grade. Students will be already working with patterns as part of their fluency work, and work with arithmetic patterns will continue in future grades. This will leave more time to focus on the other standards in this cluster. Students have been working in numbers in a base 10 since kindergarten. Here we see guidance for combining lessons to reduce time, limiting required practice, and for 3MBTA3, making sure to emphasize connections to single-digit projects and 10 units that students learned previously. Within the measurement and data domain, recommendations for combining lessons, reducing practice, and eliminating some lessons. There is also a suggestion to integrate measurement concepts into word problems when teaching other standards from the OA domain. Connecting length to fractions is encouraged, as is integrating the study of perimeter and area together. Geometry does not have a high emphasis, and this is where you can make up some time to use on priority standards. Now that I know the priorities for my grade, I'll trace back to the standards from the previous grade to identify the most critical gaps. A good place to start is consider your own grade level standards and complete the statement, students could master this new standard if they just knew blank. Once you've articulated the skills students need to learn, it will be easier to map this to an actual standard. Remember, our goal is to consistently use on grade level material, tasks and assignments, and provide scaffolds where needed rather than just teaching all of the prior grade level content for that standard. Let's look at an example. In our case study, we identified 3NFA as a priority for third grade. Third grade is the first grade that has fractions as a domain, and students will work toward understanding fractions as numbers in their first year of formal fraction studies. Let's start with the first standard in this group, 3NFA1. Understand a fraction, 1 over b, as the quantity formed by one part when a whole is partitioned into b equal parts. Understand a fraction, a over b, as the quantity formed by a parts of size 1b. This standard maps back to two standards in second grade. 2GA3, partitioning circles and rectangles into 2, 3, or 4 equal shares, describing the shares using halves, thirds, half of a third, etc., and describing the whole as 2 halves, 3 thirds, 4 fourths. Recognize that equal shares of identical wholes need to have the same shape. And 2MDA2, measuring the length of an object twice using length units of different lengths for the two measurements and describing how the two measurements relate to the unit, the size of the unit chosen. Now that I know which standards to look at, I need to consider how much these were emphasized in the previous grade. The geometry standard was part of an additional cluster, so it may not have had as much emphasis, and the measurement and data standard was part of a major cluster, so I would expect the teacher would have spent more time on it. Second grade students explore fractional parts of a whole visually with the geometry standard, while they examine how a part relates to the size of a whole in the measurement standard. I also want to consider when these standards were taught in the previous grade. Both would be taught toward the end of second grade, which means students may have learned them in a virtual setting at a time And teachers and students were becoming familiar about what learning was like in that environment. This doesn't mean they weren't taught these topics, but I need to determine if my students will need additional support on these concepts. Putting it all together, as I begin teaching my third grade students about fractions, I need to consider adding supports for visual representations and vocabulary, halves, thirds, half of, third of, etc., that my students may not have fully experienced in second grade. Sometimes adding scaffolds to lessons does not need a lot of additional time, but in other instances, we might need to adjust our pacing guide to ensure for acceleration support. Having mapped the standards, we have a good idea of where acceleration needs to take place, so now we can include that in our pacing with our school calendar. We will talk in more detail about scaffolding instruction in our modules on unit planning and lesson planning. Remember that scaffolding does not mean simplifying the content. For more information about scaffolding, please see our module on universal design, differentiation, and scaffolding. When determining where to provide acceleration, we need to identify which unfinished learning needs should be addressed using high-quality assessments. We go into detail on how to do this in a virtual setting in our module on virtual screening and progress monitoring. We also need to think about where and when to provide just-in-time supports as related to skills and concepts that appear in the current grade level. As we've said before, we're not going to assume that students don't know something. We need to take some time to find out. And we want to keep in mind that even if there are gaps, we may not need a full day's lesson to address them. Our last step is mapping what needs to be done to the school calendar. Working backwards from the identified state testing date is a good way to ensure that you teach the standards and topics that students need to know for the assessment. You can start with your established or the published pacing guide and map it to the school calendar. Most textbook publishers have already front-loaded standards that are critical to state assessments. Then, consider how many of these standards you will still need to teach. If you are behind in your pacing, which priority standards have you not taught yet? Make adjustments to the calendar to ensure coverage. Depending on your students' needs, will you require any additional time for learning supports? In most cases, this will perhaps add 1 to 2 days to the normal pace for a unit. In our next module, we will talk in more depth about how to plan supports within a specified unit of study. We've already looked at mapping grade level standards, so now let's think about how this affects pacing. When thinking of potential gaps, I want to look back at the prior year and consider which standards were taught with virtual instruction. Looking back at second grade, the last two learning modules focused on problem solving with length, money, data, time, shapes, and fractions as equal parts shapes. When we consider our priority standard of building understanding of fractions, we see that skills and concepts learned in Module 8 in second grade are needed for success in our third grade unit on fractions. Students will not have had the experience of understanding and working with equal parts of shapes, which is a lead-in skill for understanding unit fractions, which are critical to understanding how fractions fit onto the number line. For yearly planning, I need to be aware that extra instructional time will likely be needed for this unit to build those lead-in skills. Module 7 in second grade focused on problem solving with length, money, and data, and Module 8 focused on time and geometry, shapes. This is not a focus in third grade standards, so extra time may be needed to teach missed concepts. Also, students have not had extensive practice in problem solving with measurements, so extra time may be needed here as well. However, I'm not going to assume that students don't know anything at all about these concepts. I'm going to take a bit of a time to find out. We'll go into more detail about assessment in our module on unit planning and lesson planning, as well as how to incorporate teaching and learning of these new skills and concepts with our on-grade level work. In summary, when thinking about year planning for closing the achievement gap using the acceleration strategy, exposure to grade level content, materials, and assignments is priority for all of our students. Start by using your scope and sequence documents and/or your pacing guide to determine when standards are typically taught and how much time you typically had or needed to teach them. Then identify the most critical skills and concepts of each unit and standard and consider the needed prerequisites. Anticipate gaps and allow time to provide acceleration where skills and concepts link to the current grade levels work. I hope you found the information in this module helpful and will plan to join us for other modules in this series. Please feel free to reach out to any member of the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project team with questions or comments.